Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is July in Virginia, and I am sitting out here in the garage, and the sun is setting. And do you know what's as beautiful as the setting sun in Virginia? Jedidiah. And I have the complete joy of speaking with the one and only Jedidiah this year. And Jedidiah's been sending me papers, and I've been reading stuff, and it's just so much fun. And I always have so much fun talking. Jedidiah, it's been too long, and I want to know what you're thinking about. I know you sent me stuff, and I've been reading about logic and fun things, but what are you thinking about, Jedidiah? What are you thinking about?
Well, I've been thinking about not thinking with my good friend Nagarjuna, the pioneer of the Madhyamaka school, Buddhism, because like there's a kind of like been attracted recently to uh, radical negation, right? And what survives after the moment of like almost absolute negation, which Nagarjuna's logic, which we'll get into. We'll explain that for listeners that are, unfamiliar with his model. But what survives after radical negation? And so this is connected to some of the research I do in AI, which obviously really touches on philosophy, but it also just personally edifying in terms of just like, okay, well, if I begin to assume what I don't know as a structural necessity, what do we do from there? What's possible once we say, there's certain things we just can't be certain about. So how do we navigate that in terms of just higher order thinking? Essentially, is kind of what we're proposing here, is kind of moving logic from a binary dimension into a ternary dimension. So three terms, true, false, and uncertain versus just true, false. So that's kind of what's been on my mind, and I know I sent over. I don't even remember the title of this paper, just because I'm sketching these models with AI. So these come out of my original thinking, but also you lean on the tools when you don't have the time.
For sure.
I don't have the luxury of years of thinking to get into active development when it comes to business matters, but. Um, the paper itself it's about the semantic dimensionality of logic. So we're moving from binary logic to ternary logic, and that's essentially kind of the subject of some of the discussion today. And then we'll get into how that ties into the question in Christian metaphysics of the hypostasis or the person, and why that is so important.
No, that's magnificent. Again, it's always a delight to speak with you. And my good friend Quinn always did, and I'm terrible with saying words, as you know, but did a lot on Narjuna and sort of that kind of way of thinking with Hegel and speaking through that. And what I really like on what you're saying there is on this question of, is there something about not knowing that is structural? As opposed to just merely an epistemic failure. We tend to associate not knowing with a kind of failure, but what if it's actually structural? And, in terms of that structure, what does the uncertainty, I want to say, enable or make possible? And what's interesting is to think of, I like to talk about, inspired by the extraordinary Anthony Morley on Leibniz. I'm talking about kind of metageometry, and my mind goes there with how the paper was talking and also speaking with you about how, in a way, uncertainty is being used here. If I speak freely and just correct me on any things or any thoughts at all, it turns true and false into almost geometries. Like it turns them actually into having texture,
Right.
and that they're unfolding. And the issue is, if uncertainty is more ontological, which of course is $1 million word, means many things, but if it's not merely epistemological, but it's ontological, then what would it mean to think about true and false, which the brain immediately goes to binaries, points, right? But what does it mean to think of them more as textures or landscapes or curve, like having shape? Like when something is false, you almost imagine it as the true curves away from. Curves is a loaded term, but it's like it doesn't go there, right?
Right.
And yet the uncertainty could also be what makes it possible for the truth to curve. Maybe I should associate the curvature more with uncertainty and the false with just mere negativity. So the curvature of truth then in that way is actually, I guess, moving away from the false, to speak very freely, is actually what then gives it shape, right? And if truth didn't have uncertainty, it'd be dead. It would just be out. It would just be a point, right? And
Right.
so, what would it mean to incorporate into our thinking about true and false uncertainty that actually will give it a geometry, that will move it to geometry. And I do think generally the major problem with logic is that we've been thinking about it in terms of binary. A thing has being or it doesn't. It's like being and nothing. Now, obviously, this is the part where I have to bring in Hegel, because a lot of my kind of interested in the sublation of logic comes from, thanks to Cadell Last, sort of thinking of the science of logic with Hegel. And, for Hegel, it wasn't that Aristotle was wrong, but it was kind of incomplete. It needed to be sublated. It needed to be brought up. There's a way in which the law of identity, A is A, did not capture the full reality of a thing, but unfortunately gave the impression that it did, so it was prone to overfit and to overuse. And so famously, Hegel is like, if I say a tree is a tree, it's empty. That doesn't tell us anything, right? And
Yeah.
by the way, in order to describe what a tree is, I have to start telling you what roots are, and I have to start telling you what a branch is, and I start having, oh wait, so to tell you what a tree is, I have to tell you, well, I have to talk about things a tree isn't, or that it have existence other than the tree. What are we talking about then? So there's always this passing over into otherness is the language, right? Or the language can be, it is always becoming. The famous term in Hegel is becoming. So if you think being, you can't think it. If you think nothing, you can't think it. But between, you get the becoming, as is famous at the beginning of the science of logic. Well, becoming is a geography. Like automatically, if you use the word becoming, you're talking some kind of geometry then. Because there has to be a, dare I say, space for the movement to occur. There has to be something by which the movement can occur. And the question becomes then, what is the characteristic of that quote unquote space by which phenomenon are becoming themselves? Because if you start saying that space is separate from the phenomenon, do you have a hard dualism? Is the background that affords the possibility of becoming other than the substance of which is becoming, or is it somehow participating in it? And what degree? And then you would almost have to say, like Hegel will start, and I'll throw it to you on any thoughts. These are just opening thoughts. Then Hegel has to start saying, well, things are almost like an embryo, right? Like it births
Right.
into a being. So it contains within it the potential to unfold, right? Now, of course, the language they use, famously, the German idealists, and Todd McGowan has asked if this was a good word to use, but the term they use is, of course, contradiction. That everything has a contradiction, but it's not a logical contradiction. It's a contradiction of a certain tension that everything has, that then has it become other, has it unfold. So it's not so much that there's a background of a second substance from things, but that they contain within them the tension of which can
Yeah.
make them become and kind of curve into their geometry, I almost want to say, unfold into their determination. And then, of course, Hegel is saying, and then I'll throw it to you, that our logic does not reflect this ontological, the way things are. It doesn't reflect ontology, and that in an increasingly complex world, failure to update our logic will be extremely consequential. Like maybe 500 years ago, using A as A logic was not so consequential because the world was maybe slower, less interconnected, less technologically advanced. It wasn't complete, but the consequences perhaps were less dire. But you could argue now, vaster complexity, pluralism, interconnectivity, a failure to sublate our logic can be a major problem. And Cadell is extremely good on that. But those are some thoughts. So obviously I had to bring in Hegel, but I'd be
Yeah.
curious any thoughts coming to mind for you.
So yeah, so like some preliminary thoughts. So a lot of what you're talking about in Hegel, like, and I'm only saying this because I'm like actually in the middle of reading Nicholas of Cusa's The Vision of God, which, by the
Oh.
way, if you're into good devotional reading, that's an excellent source. It's
Mm.
intellectually challenging because he uses these explosive metaphors that will break your brain, like they will. Um, but that's kind of they do that by design. But he talks about, virtuality, right? So what the seed holds is the virtual tree, right? And we need to think of virtual not in terms of like contemporary parlance of virtual, therefore not real reality. It's actually tied to virtue, right? It's the seed becomes the tree because it already by virtue contains the tree within it, right? And then he talks about coincidence of opposites, right? And that forms essentially kind of the walled garden of paradise that you must learn ignorance in order to pass into. And so I think Q's is really important in this discussion as well. So we may want to toggle back and forth between, because I don't know entirely Hegel's lineage, but I'm assuming, based on my reading of him, he's got to have some Q's in his own
Sure.
intellectual lineage. Just it seems pretty obvious there. Um, but what a lot of like what I do is, at a practical level is, how is a functional pluralism attainable? I come in from my Western milieu as a Christian, and it, I think, I wouldn't say it's like the responsibility of everybody that's a Westerner or Christian in their orientation to, pursue other thought forms, but I've been drawn there, specifically within the Dharmic traditions themselves, because they have so many interesting, like, philosophical and intellectual and spiritual implications. Um, and so what I find is that in Nagarjuna, and he's kind of the pioneer of the Madhyamaka school, broadly situated within Mahayana Buddhism. And like he employs what I would call is, I have not found anybody in my own research and reading that is kind of hinges on more radical negation than Nagarjuna. Like, I think he leaves Kant and Hegel in the dust in terms of, like, he essentially negates everything and says that the emptiness of all things is basically the stopping point of all reason, right? There, you just can't get past that. That's a vehicle in the Buddhist schools for non-dual realization,
Mhm.
which I take as a fundamental and it's an important structure of realization. I don't know if it's, I don't have any fundamental challenge to non-duality. I'm a monist, right? So, I posit no significant argument there, but is there something that happens after negation, or do we have to stay there and then, that has its own problems? But uh, Nagarjuna posits a kind of a four-part logic in Madhyamaka that is called kataskoti, or it's called a tetralemma, right? And tetralemmas show up in some interesting places outside of Nagarjuna's thinking. The Chalcedonian definition is also a tetralemma, right? So four-part logics, the reason why they're great is four-part structures are stable, right? So
Mhm.
they really give you and it's just geometrically, it's a very stable logical configuration. So I'll explain, and I'm not a philosopher and I'm not, an expert in, Buddhist philosophy or any other philosophy for that matter, but I'll give my best kind of rundown of an explanation because it'll be important for those that are kind of tuning into this conversation to have a basic working knowledge of where that works. I would also encourage you to just look up Nagarjuna and Tetralemma, right? And you'll get a wealth of information just by looking it up either on AI or external web search. It'll give you a good breakdown. But it's basically a four-part logical movement. And one of the primary areas of interrogation, as you know, in Buddhist school, Buddhists are differential from their other Dharmic partners, the Hindus, because Buddhists hold to no self, where most Hindu schools hold to some sort of model of the self as foundational. And it's really an interesting aporia in the Dharmic traditions, is, well, which is which? So if we look in the kind of the Buddhist register, which operates, substantially in that no self territory, Nagarjuna offers his tetralemma, or his four-part logical interrogation of of whether or not we can posit a self. And so there's kind of four movements. The first movement is one of it's still working in the binary register of affirmation and denial, right? So we're, positive or negative statements. So that's going to be important because we're proposing another step after that. But in his step, the first step, let's talk about the self. So we would posit there is a self, right? And that's the first movement. And he goes through his interrogations of why that may or may not be the case. The second movement is the denial. There is no self, right? And he'll, again, logical analysis of why that is or is not the case. Then he moves to his third movement, which is there is both self and no self, right? And so that entails certain obvious logical contradictions, but he'll explain what those are. And the final movement in toward non-dual realization is that there is neither self nor not self. And that leads you to the realization of the Mahayana concept of shunyata, highly correlated with nirvana, right? It's a state of what I would call active emptiness, right? and that there is no, there is no substance metaphysics in this school of thought. So there's no independent essence floating out there. Everything is basically arises out of that through dependent origination. And philosophically, it's, the logical rigor is exceptional. It's one of the most logically well thought out systems I've ever encountered. But you're left with this kind of dilemma, especially as a Westerner, right? Because like what Nagarjuna has basically done, I mean, his primary debate partners are really more within the Hindus. They're in India, when second century CE or AD, if you're a traditionalist, right? They're ironing out these systems, and both sides are really advancing and developing rapidly at this point. But he's trying to get to the point of this radical negation to non-dual realization. But for the Westerner, for guys like you and me, we cut our eye teeth on substance metaphysics of some kind, right? Whether we're chasing the elusive Kantian Ding an sich, or the divine essence, or all these kinds of things. Like we're locked into that register, and kind of have been since the pre-Socratics,
Sure.
right? So what do you do with an active nothing, an active lack? And is that the final movement? Is negation the final movement and the cessation of thinking and all those kinds of things? So I was running a thought experiment a couple weeks ago, where I was like, well, like our theoretical model, and I don't want to get too much into that because it's not super pertinent right now, but it rests on ternary logic. So it has a positive state, a negative state, and a neutral or a zero state. It can be represented coding wise in balanced ternary, which is +1, -1, and 0 in the middle. And 0 can stand for a lot of things. 1 and -1 can also stand for a lot of things, but they're good placeholders in terms of just a coding language. And so I was like, well, what happens if we ran Nagarjuna's analysis out of binary logic and into a ternary logic that allows for that 0 state to represent uncertainty, and just take uncertainty as a structural component of reason?
Yeah.
Right? Because the end, like my personal take is the end take of Nagarjuna's logic is you are left with a foundational uncertainty. Like uncertainty is actually a foundational ontological feature of existence, the lack that we talked about last time, right? You get to the lack, that's foundational. Is that, and that's probably more or less a feature of binary logic, of true false statements. And true false statements are not entirely incorrect, but they become very brittle when you're trying to build dynamic systems where you have to concede at some level. You're always dealing with uncertainty. So what we did is another tetralemma. We moved from Nagarjuna's tetralemma to our ternary tetralemma, where what we did is saying, now that uncertainty has been metabolized and is a feature of our logic, what happens then, right? And I'll get into that a little bit, but I kind of want to give you a little bit of time to digest that, and then I'll then explain kind of our ternary tetralemma, kind of the structure of the overall argument and some of the implications after that.
Well, I mean, what I'll say so far is I think that is fantastic and right on it. I think that there is no self and there is no self, right? Like for me, I've already always experienced that as basically what that does is create a certain instability, right? So because it's very interesting, because when you there's one way where you say, oh, that's the end of thought, like there's this kind of radical negation. And there's thinking about that through a binary sense, which is like kind of an equilibrium. But actually, the lived experience, which is interesting, like the lived experience in that place is a certain sort of going back and forth, or a certain sort of what exactly does that mean, that I think actually creates a certain openness, right? That actually creates a kind of outward motion, right? Because again, I go back to where uncertainty for me creates movement. Like there's something about movement and uncertainty that goes together when it is brought together into true and false in the way that you're describing, right? Because if you were to just say like uncertainty as a stagnant state, it's like in the middle, Schrodinger's cat doesn't know what it wants to be, right? But the actual experience of uncertainty as a structural feature of truth and falsity, like thinking of it in those terms actually then creates a movement, like that you actually have to then kind of you have to actually move with it. And to me that starts getting, I guess I'm already kind of showing my hand, to me that's where you get, in a sense, that propulsion, that movement, which I think ultimately starts getting into attention, looking out, meditating upon the forms, all of that stuff, starts getting at what exactly is beyond radical negation. And, the other thing I would just say is, yeah, there's this weird move in Hegel where you have the negation and then you have the negation of the negation. But what does that leave you? Like, what does that leave you? What is the quality of the lack? And is lack nothing, or is lack not nothing, as Jock and I will talk about? Is lack some sort of fundamental nothingness, or is the term from the paper the plenum that seems to have this liveliness to it that then is going to cause a movement that brings with it a necessary unfolding into a determination? The term I see used, like a Markov blanket, that then, the probability, once you get kind of a state where you have containment of free, you've reduced the free energy, as I've understand. Now you have a determination, and all of that could be contained. So I would just say that so far I like everything that you're saying, and it is also bringing to the other thinker who comes to mind here that I won't get into, but I think is relevant, is I have a good friend, Thomas Wynne, who does a lot of really good work on the later Heidegger. And there's a lot of argument to be said that the later Heidegger is unexplored, ignored. And he was really, and of course, the later Heidegger goes to Japan, right? He's interested, he has visits with Japanese thinking, and he
Yeah.
really develops this thinking of the clearing.
Mm-hmm.
And and there's this weird question of what exactly is the clearing, because
Mm-hmm.
it's not nihil, he's talking about the question of being ends in nihilism. He almost kind of gives up. He does. He basically abandons being and being in time, the project. But then toward the end of his life, he does work called Time and Being, and he's kind of trying to re-explore it. And he comes up with this thinking of the clearing. And Thomas Wynne will stress letting be, and that there is something about the letting be that actually is the proper ending of nihilism, which I think is pointing to, in a sense, where this radical negation could perhaps lead to. But a lot more needs to be said on that. But I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah. So just one little thing pops into my head is like if we think about like the dynamics of adventure, right?
Mm.
Think Magellan or something like that, right? The whole enterprise is predicated on uncertainty, right? It's actually it provides a telos, right? It actually, uncertainty provides like a pull in adventure, and it does the same thing in our cognition because it gives us something to figure out, right? And we can linger for centuries even on specific logical and philosophical problems and still never really fully exhaust them, right? And then we may feel like we've exhausted them to a certain degree, but you still have to say, well, we're still here and we're still thinking, now what? Right? So there is an element where I think that like epistemology really fundamentally actually invert epistemology to a degree. It begins with what you don't know, right? And so it's really a kind of a vital movement of it's actually what makes movement possible. It's what makes time possible, right? Is the notion of uncertainty. Because in total certainty, that's like essentially a divine property, and time disappears there. There's basically no meaning in eternity, qua eternity, right? So there's a sense where our uncertainty is actually what holds us in existence, right? And so it's really structurally important. And so what we should do, I mean, unless you have anything else you wanted to add to that, I can kind of break down like our ternary trilemma, or not trilemma, tetralemma. I can break that down just to give people a sense of the contour of the movement of the argument, so that we can kind of launch from there into everything that follows.
Please do. The only thing I would say is, first, before I forget, the best philosophers don't call themselves philosophers. So, did I? So please, thank you. I always enjoy your philosophical reflections. And second, what's very interesting to me is what I think about, like in thinking to Najad, is that there's such thing as a true uncertainty. Like we tend to think that if uncertainty means not true, but you can have a true uncertainty, meaning I see mountains there, And that's true, but I'm also uncertain what that means because I haven't gone there. I'm uncertain the determinations of the mountains, right? The issue is you can have a true uncertainty and you can have a false uncertainty.
Right.
And the issue is that basically you're always dealing with either in a certain degree, I would argue you're always dealing with true uncertainties or false uncertainties. And again, to me, you're automatic, and then I'll throw it to you because I'd love you to go through all that. The moment you think about a true uncertainty, it is hard to imagine as a point, but it is easy to imagine as a geometry. Imagine you're on a hill and it curves down or it curves up. Like it's true, you know this is a hill, right?
Hmm.
You're uncertain where it goes or what it means, right? And I
Right.
think basically in some respects, I feel like this is just an assertion that, maybe right or maybe wrong. I always think in the same way that I think quote unquote algebra needs to always be brought into geometry. But yeah, like in the same way, there's always that question of is math created or discovered, right? And there's a certain way for me, and again, this is very general because I know there are forms of algebra that are how to do algebra into geometry and all that other stuff, and I'm not bashing that, but there's always this idea that perhaps a test is can the algebra be brought into geometry? If not, then there's might be a higher chance that you're dealing with something created versus discovered. Well, likewise, if you cannot bring your logic or the way you think about logic into, I like to say, a situation, or even just a kind of analogical, geometrical unfolding to you. Can you imagine this logical statement as a terrain, as a something you could walk, something you could be in, as a geometry? If not, there may be mistakes in the logical categories that are being presented because it's not something that you can dwell in. And to me, to think about something or to move in, like a logic you can't move in, seems very problematic. But then but what this would mean is in order to have logics that you can move in, you have to make uncertainty a feature, not a bug, because movement is impossible without uncertainty, as you've already said. So I like to think about, kind of true uncertainty as here's a hill. I know this is a hill and it drops off. It's true that I can't see what's over the horizon. It's true that there is a horizon. It's true that there is a hill. It's true that I could walk there. All of these things are true, but they're true to facilitate an uncertainty. And
Right.
that I think about that a lot. So that was coming to mind, but please go through the categories.
Right. So, well, let's do that. And I love the analogy of kind of mountaineering here because it's a good one, right? So if you're, ascending the north face of a hill, you have zero awareness of what the south face of the hill looks like, right? And so your uncertainty if you're, climbing the hill is really your light cone is going to be bounded by the hill that you're on, right? And the ridge line and its relation to the horizon and all those kinds of things. And it's only in ascending the hill that then, if you're ascending the north face, that the south face becomes visible and knowable, right? And then the next ridge line goes from there. And so it's just like you're toggling between the uncertainty of where you are with relative to where you're going, and that journey just sort of it's a wave function, right? And so, if you're sitting in the trough, you're going to have a certain view, and if you're sitting at the peak, you're going to have a certain view, and they're different. But it has to do with kind of cognitive lensing. Where's your light cone? What's your light cone capable of capturing at any given moment? And your light cone could be visual or it could be cognitive, right? What can my mind see? What can my mind put together? And you can't put together the north face from the south face under most conditions.
Oh, and just as a quick comment, I mean, there's something almost, something because obviously Lacan and a lot of the analytical thinkers are very interested in what truth is to us. And there just seems to be something libidinal about a truth that doesn't require movement because it doesn't require anything of you. But again, what the suggestion here is any truth that doesn't require movement is problematic. And it's almost as if what we've been trying to do is find logic independent of movement, which perhaps has a libidinal reason for it, because for Lacan, the mind is always drenched in libidinal, because that means we don't have to do anything. We don't have to
Right.
move. Like we can capture the whole. Whereas once you talk about a true uncertainty, that demands movement and demands something of us, which is not so libidinally enjoyable. So that was coming to mind.
Right. Okay. Well, very cool. Well, let's jump in. I'm going to have to like refer to my notes because I'm a
Please.
cheater. I cram before class. So so let's go ahead and just, by way of review for Nagarjuna's tetralemma, binary logic, true and false, neither true nor false. That's the tetralemma, right? And so once we've arrived at neither true nor false, we can be certain about nothing. So what do you do from there? So what we're going to do is what's called an up-dimensional move. So we're moving out of binary logic and saying statements can be true, false, or uncertain. That's kind of the core movement that we're doing by adding the third term. So I'm going to go ahead and just read from my notes here because that's going to be the easiest way to kind of get there, or just kind of summarize some notes, right? So the first movement is a determination. So a proposition contains both true and false statements. So that is kind of the first movement is like we can make a determination, that something is true or false, or even a blending of true and false, right? So the proposition is restricted entirely within the binary realm, right? I'm sorry, and I have to go back. You can't blend these in this portion of the movement, right? So it must receive either a discrete true statement or a discrete false statement. So the sky is purple. It needs to be, observationally validated. Maybe during the sunrise or sunset, you get some purple hues in there, but typically it's, kind of sky blue, right? So you're making a determination predicated on whether or not that proposition is true or false. So that's just kind of, in some sense, the affirmation of the validity of true and false statements, right? The next movement is the indeterminate. So a proposition is uncertain. So that's the uncertainty in the logic, which basically says it all resolves back to this same kind of 0 point that Nagarjuna is identifying is, kind of like neither nor. We can say nothing else about that. The proposition can be identical to that, right? So there's our second movement. Third movement, though, this is where things start to really get interesting, is that we move into from determinate to indeterminate to superposition, right? Which kind of gets us into Schrodinger's experiments and those kind of things. And what this is essentially saying is that an assertion P holds a discrete binary value and remains uncollapsed wave at the same time. So what this means is like it's, contradiction in classical logic is kind of a syntactical error. In the ternary phase space, it's basically describing a standing wave or a localized node that's anchored in a continuous field, right? So if it's uncollapsed in movement one or collapsed in movement one, which is it's determined to be true or false, then that's stage one. It could be movement two where it's uncollapsed. And in three, that's where we start to get the wave dynamics, right? And so we kind of move into a wave dynamic where uncertainty is basically woven into the fabric of the logic itself. And then the final movement brings us from the determinate to the indeterminate, to the superposition. And then finally, it moves us to the substrate or the null field itself. And what's happening here is essentially we're identifying that basically if P cannot be evaluated as a discrete state of true or false, nor as a wave of potential uncertainty, the logic exhausts its own syntactic capacity. The statement points to the computable values of the medium, the hardware, or the geometry executing the logic itself. So it becomes thermodynamic in its overall orientation. So to summarize, we move from determinate 1, 2, indeterminate, 3, superposition, and then 4, the substrate itself. So what happens is when you up dimension Nagarjuna's shunyata, his non-dual realization, which says that there's nothing there, that nothing, that lack, basically becomes a plenum. So you have an obversity, two sides of the same coin. As you've up dimensioned side B of the coin, side A says it's empty, there's nothing there, there's no inherent essential existence that can be identified through rational binary analysis, right? So that's been secured. But what happens when you add the dimension of uncertainty, you're basically metabolizing the uncertainty into your logic, is that same sunyata or emptiness or null point still is a null point, but it's a null point that is a plenitude or a plenum, right? So it's not it's still in the neither nor, but it's a something, right? Out of which, all rational and cognitive activity emerges. And so the insertion of uncertainty doesn't mean that we can't make true and false statements, right? It just means that not in every case can everything be contained by a true and false statement. And that's important because that opens up, we're no longer moving on a straight line between point A and point B. We have to account for the third, which means this is happening, which is a structure, which means form and geometry are now possible.
Right.
To be like at the rational level, to interrogate them, when you finally admit, I don't know everything, there's a lot that I'm uncertain about. Once you get there, that's where the form emerges, right? But not before. So you can't derive forms from Nagarjuna. You just form and formlessness, the same thing. Here, by up dimensioning the uncertainty into the logic itself, you all of a sudden you have structure. So
Brilliant. Just as a few things, and certainly it's not a perfect overlap at all. But when I was working on a lot of like the map is indestructible with Alfred Korbisky, who's the one who comes up with the phrase "the map is not the territory," and also I went through an obsessive phase of like 11 years from like 20, well, actually like 18 to 28 of really being like A is A has to be true, and yet it's not. How does that work? And kind of just writing and scribbling forever because I was very like, and I had this paper called A is A and rewrote it like an unbelievable amount of times because it was this weird kind of thing is how is something self-evident seemingly not capturing the fullness. Like there's some, because clearly my idea of a cat does not equal the same as the phenomenon of a cat. And yet yet I need the idea of the cat, which the cat is not, in order to identify it. So the phrase A is an idea that the thing that I'm using it to refer to isn't, that captures its identity. So there's something slipping out. And how do you catch that in logic? And what would it mean to have a logic that was around that? And the closest parallel I found was Korbisky's thinking on like science and sanity. And he's basically, I don't think he's aware of the Kyoto School or anything like that. But there is for him, just like Hegel, I think, although I don't believe he liked Hegel, which is always funny. Usually the people dislike is who they're most like. It's great. It's one of the great cosmic jokes.
right.
But there was really a sense that if logic was not updated, for him there would be mental illness. Like that, this conversation we're having for him is not just a geeky kind of logic conversation. That there are truly real stakes. Because if you're in a world, say pluralism, that arguably needs some kind of dwelling in the null space or some sort of letting be, and you don't get that, you're going to have socioeconomic political ramifications. Like it doesn't seem like logic matters, but logic really does matter because it determines the possibilities of what your politics can think, what your economics can think, what your people can think, and that can have real world consequences. But anyway, for me, what kind of came up for me is that true and false was the language of the map. If I would like, the maps are about that, but all maps must have a girdle point, which I would loosely associate with the superposition. But then
Yeah.
actually the name of the game is dwelling in the girdle point. And
Right.
that's when you're getting something more like the null space. And that's where you're actually letting the reality of lack unveil itself to you. Because there's a move where if you simply say lack is not nothing, then lack can't unveil anything to you, right? And actually be a sort of plenum in that way, right?
Right.
And see that. So for me, a lot of the question of global pluralism has to deal with dwelling in the girdle point, not merely acknowledging the girdle point. Because the argument I want to make is that actually, if you stay in the superpositions, if I use that, like if you just acknowledge the girdle point, that can actually make the problem of maps worse, because you actually then can say nothing can show my map to be true or false. You acknowledge incompleteness and then say, well, every map is incomplete, just like mine, therefore I don't have to change, because no map is better than mine. It no longer becomes invitational, if you will. It actually is the final, almost death nail in pluralism, because your map is now invincible. You acknowledge the map is not the territory. You acknowledge that it is not complete, and yet you also then equalize and say, well, all maps are incomplete, and therefore the fact that mine is just a map doesn't mean it's any less or more true than anyone else's. Therefore, I don't have to change or take anyone seriously. So you
Right.
take the realization the map is not the territory to make it indestructible, as opposed to actually dwelling in the null space, dwelling in the girdle point, to actually open yourself up to the plenum, to open yourself up to otherness, to actually experience what is possible there. And I completely agree that there is something about the null space, dwelling in the girdle point, that is necessary for form, that is necessary for, and also therefore geometry, and therefore dealing with global pluralism, because you can't really deal with pluralism unless you move thought to something more geometrical. Like if you're stuck in the binary, then it's just going to be colliding. So to me, also, when you say thermodynamic, like in the null field, you're dealing with something thermodynamic. Well, I associate that then with basically beholding something. Like there is a process that is being undergone that you are to observe and participate in, more than thinking becomes more about somehow observing that. Like to turn, well, and we spoke about it before we started recording, and again, I'll throw it to you for any thoughts on any of this. Plato has this interesting idea where thought has to turn into something you watch. It turns into something you observe. And this also, for me, gets into the mystery of the relationship between thinking and imagination, because, we like to split those things, but I think they're actually kind of in a way longing for one another, because there's something about where thinking wants to actually use imagination to behold the forms. Like thinking, but they get split, and it's only in the null space that imagination and let's say rational or logic come together, and actually then you're able to observe how this metageometry of being, because there's this weird idea of being able to behold being, to like witness being. And you're like, well, what does that mean? Because being is a pure abstraction, but there's actually some sort of point where you can logically arrive at a way of understanding how things must unfold, that then you're actually able to imagine that geometry occurring. And there's something beautiful about that, something captivating about that, that then actually could unify people in pluralism around. Now, that was all very large and a lot of different things, and gets into, for me, how thinking also in a psychoanalytically, I think thinking longs to be a dream, meaning like what rationality wants is to be free of determination. Like in a dream, you know how you observe things in a dream, but they're not binding, they seem different, but they're not. So thinking actually then in our waking life almost kind of subconsciously is working to free us from determination, but that means we actually die because we need determination to form. So what ends up happening is that if we don't actually learn to dwell in the girdle point or dwell in the null space, if I use that language, then we're kind of caught on a campaign of thinking to be free of determination, which you could argue forms of virtual reality, AI, technology, trying to transhumanism is freedom from determination, meaning you're trying to make waking life like a dream, which I think is the ultimate libidinal accomplishment. Like that is what the libidinal brain wants really, really badly. But that's where we fail to actually figure out how to bring thinking into the experience of watching the forms, where we actually see a kind of determination that is unfolding, that get to participate in, which is more like the strike of beauty, which is more associated with beauty, that actually we long for, but that can only be done in the null space. Now that was a bunch of different things, but those are thoughts, and there's a lot more, but let me throw it to you.
Okay, so let's play with this analogy, because I think that this can help drive things forward. So I'm not sure if this is true, but this is just like a off the cuff observation. But I would liken like our binary logic, which is what the rational mind has developed within and is framed upon, is autopsy. Right. So you can only really use it to analyze true false statements, which means you can't really make true false statements about the future. You can make predictions, but again, there's uncertainty there. So your true false statements really have to be analysis of everything in the past. The dead artifacts of the past become something that we say true false about, right? Or here's what we know because like kind of the past is kind of concrete, so it becomes an observable data point, right? So if binary thinking, and I'm not knocking autopsy, by the way, that's not that's not derogatory about binary logic, but it seems to function kind of like as this autopsy of what we now know, right? Which means that all that phenomenon is kind of passed away into the present, and you're evaluating it from that vantage point. Imagination, however, it is predicated on that uncertainty. So if binary is the interrogation and the autopsy of the dead object, the imagination and the ternary logic that it entails, which is predicated on uncertainty, is of the living subject. What is now possible? I don't know, but I got an idea about it. So I'm going to pursue it, and either it's going to be determined true or false, but I don't know that at this point in time, right? And it's that uncertainty that becomes the impetus for all motion, cognitive motion, right? And really this is where we get into the fundamentals of time, right? Because in three-dimensional or any dimensional space, to move from point A to point B, which requires movement, right? And as a finite agent, moving through empty space, that cognitive distance is measured in time, right? The distance, time is basically a function of movement, distance, and entropy, right? And so in our modeling for some of the work that I'm working on, we're modeling time is not fundamental, but it arises in the subject. So the living subject is supplying the time at some
Mm.
level. We can make determinative statements about time, but there is, if you talk to any physicist about the nature of time, it actually kind of evaporates into this mystery. We don't really know what it
I,
is, right? So time it has its own kind of lack that becomes
yep.
the very basis of its flow. Whether that's objective time with the way objects move through space, or subjective time, how we feel about the passage of time. We constantly feel that gradient and that flow within us, or volitional time. How quickly does it take us to make a decision, right? All of those are kind of inherent to the thinking subject. And so time is like, I mean, we can say objective, but it's still within a subjective frame,
Sure, sure,
right? Because I haven't had, rocks aren't having this conversation with each other.
sure, sure.
So you're kind of getting in the ternary logic is you're getting the dynamic, which is time, right? You're getting the lack, which is not nothing. It's a something, right? It may be indeterminate something, right? Or an uncertain something, but that's what it moves, it triangulates between the two, right? And it creates a definable space that you're working within. And so, when we think about the role of the imagination, and even the role of imagination in something is something as fundamental as scientific discovery. Somebody is going to make a scientific observation, and the hypothesis is a predicate on uncertainty, right? And an attempt for a closure, right? An attempt to arrive at either it's falsified or it survives falsification and it is therefore true, and can be a theorem or a theory, or it becomes something more of a stable truth. But it's that uncertainty that drives the hypothesis, right? And it will either be it's a failed hypothesis, or it can be developed into a theory, right? And then that's your next starting point. And then where's the next hypothesis go? And so you get this continual kind of, in a sense, an upward movement, where each new realization is the ground for the next one that follows. Right. And so this, probably at a cosmic and existential level, is just the dynamics of existence itself. Right. As far as what we can say about existence, which for a finite agent, there are certain things that we can say about existence. Right. Square circles don't exist. Right. We can say that, like, that's a kind of the impossible contradiction, right? The kind of the false contradiction versus a true contradiction, right? So we can say certain things and we can know at least with reasonable degrees of certainty that this is a true statement. But there's a whole degree of things that we just really can't, as a finite agent processing reality in real time, we just can't know that. And so when you as opposed to saying like I need to chase the uncertainty away, it's actually no, you need to sit with the uncertainty, right? Because the uncertainty is the very possibility of your thinking, right? If you had absolute certainty, you don't think because you just know. Right, which is there's a difference. Thinking is the process of knowing for finite agents, but in an infinite agent, we're talking about God. God doesn't need to think about things, um, at least not in any way that would be finitely recognizable. So when you're talking about, yeah, the role of imagination, it's literally an imaging forth, which is a predicated on form, right? And so what form are you imaging forth in your imagination? Can that form then obtain in three-dimensional space-time, or is it something that really needs to stay in a more of an abstract dimensional register? Those are all valid questions that are capable because you're moving thought beyond mere discrete categories of true, false, and therefore autopsy into something that is more or less metabolic in its structure.
Oh, magnificent. And again, for me, one of the things that I guess when I was like 11 or 10 or maybe 9, I'm not sure, that was, I suppose, a beginning of philosophy for me without me knowing that it was philosophy, is I was reading one of the Redwall books with the mic, maybe it was like Marvin the Mouse or something. And, I was reading it in this bathtub and suddenly I had this moment of like, oh, and I realized that I was watching a movie of a mouse fighting at the Abbey in my head. And I
Right.
had this moment where I was like, how is it that I can see this movie playing in my head while reading black marks on paper? I'm not looking at it and yet I'm seeing it. What I'm looking at is black marks on paper, words on paper, and I have a movie playing in my head, which everyone has had that experience of, right? That phenomenology, I want to say, has been kind of ground zero of the question of what is thought doing and what is the human being. And I bring that up because there's this, for me, mysterious notion of observing the forms in Plato, or this idea of the beatific vision, or all of these and obviously the beatific vision is just straight mysticism, but there's the idea of there's a certain way of experiencing the world that seems to be the height of thought, right? And I've always just been very interested in the idea that that ability to have a movie playing in your head as being some sort of height of abstraction, like that's like a real accomplishment of abstraction, somehow serving or being there precisely for the possibility of witnessing the forms. Because also too, like when you get a metageometry, like the metageometry that's described in this paper, or even just the idea of like if you see as a geometry the development of past, present, and future, and if I use Bard's VPA, which I do like, where he'll say the past is actual, it's concrete, it's occurred. The present is potential, because there's potential in the present, and the future is virtual. And he kind of means it in that Deleuzian sense, right? And
Right.
so what has happened in the past kind of determines what is possible, and what can happen in the future is also determined by the past, but it's not determined by the past, right? Like if
It's
I bring
constrained.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's constrained, right? But that would actually mean there's top-down causation, of course,
Right.
because also what the potential can be is simultaneously afforded by the history, but also the subject's awareness of what could be in the virtual, right? So all of this creates a certain trajectory, but there's a kind of curve, right? Because it also has to come back to the actual, whatever is done, right? So you can almost see this form, I almost want to say, where it's kind of moving into it has a geometry, it has something you can kind of watch as a kind of form, if you will, where you can see how the past as actual unfolds into the present, but what it unfolds to is according to the virtual, of which then kind of decides what it can be, but it also doesn't force it to be one thing. So it has a movement to it, right? And to me, you can't see that, um, but you can imagine it. And what you're kind of doing then is using imagination, not to imagine a world to escape life, because life is hard. So let me fantasize. I'm going to fantasize about a desert island, you know, an island somewhere where I don't have to go to work. But instead, what you're doing is actually using imagination to, in a sense, experience, I want to say, the determination of how the world, how reality actually is like, that you can't see directly. So you're actually using imagination in service of higher dimensional determination, like something that is, that you're not just fantasizing about, and you're using it to actually try to see it. And to me, that is the only, I guess I'm always interested in trying to explain what exactly the observing of the forms is like. And you see, the ability to even have that meta geometry requires abstract reasoning and rationality to even kind of postulate how time might unfold, right? With this kind of curvature structure to it. You know, and so you have to use but then it all comes together into a form where you can see it sort of moving. And there is something about what I want to say is it is only in the null space that you can have that experience. Because if you're, say, in the map, like I guess I want to say, like, if I'm looking at that crepe myrtle there, is it a crepe myrtle? True. Is it a crepe myrtle? False. But then, oh, well, it's both a crepe myrtle and not a crepe myrtle because it's also the branches and grandmother. So it's superposition, true and false. But then there's also the letting it be, letting be in the clearing. But I had to get there by going through the superposition because I had to see, well, it doesn't really fit into the binary categories of true and false, but now I'm letting it be. And in that letting be, and I know, you know, it's hard to talk about the non-talkable, you know, the ineffable, right? But you're
Right.
in an experience where you're trying to let the crepe myrtle there give itself over to you in such a manner that will help you form an abstract vision of the metageometry that is isomorphic with how the universe as a whole is operating. Because you believe every single phenomenon has to have the same structure. And so it's kind of an analogy of being. So I don't, those are thoughts. Let me throw it to you. And I agree that the subject makes time. I think that's really, really important. But anyway.
Okay. So this is where, you know, and we had talked in our last conversation, you were saying, I'm searching for the mean.
Mm,
And like, I'll distill that very simply. You, me, people, persons, the person is actually the cosmic mean, right? Which is, it's a thought form that's really only possible with, you know, after Christian metaphysics, right? Because in other systems, what's very difficult to establish is, you know, in the Dharmic schools, the self is more absorbed into the source, right? Or experienced as source once your incarnational journey is over, or there is no self, so you don't have to ask the question, right? Or unask the question, moo, right? Um, so what happens is, like, when you kind of interrogate this kind of personalist or hypostatic logic that comes out of our Western tradition, and really the most helpful sources that I would steer people toward would be like the hypostatic logic of Maximus the Confessor, would be the locus classicus. You could, you know, one of his great contemporary readers, Jordan Daniel Wood, you know, wrote a book on basically creation as incarnation, right? In the whole mystery, or the cosmic mystery of Christ. I forget the title. We're talking, and that's not in my head right now. But Jordan's work is really phenomenal on this front. But, you know, so the West has kind of posited that, you know, personal existence is not just like a, you know, dependent arising that then just dissolves after death, or at some point once you've escaped the cycle of samsara. That the personal existence is a perduring reality, endures. It's infinite or epictastic in terms of its capacity for experience, right? So how does that work? And how do we not do violence to the logics of systems that say no self, or self-absorption, essentially, right? Some sort of dissolving. Like, I remember reading through the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and he likened, you know, the dissolving, you know, imagine yourself, the self is like a salt pillar or salt sculpture, that when the sea comes, it just dissolves into the sea, right? It's a beautiful metaphor, a little bit terrifying if you're a Christian, though, right? Is like, I want to do justice to Sri Ramakrishna because, like, he's fascinating, right? And I want to do justice to guys like Nagarjuna who say no self, or there is neither nor, right? Okay, cool. What does that mean now for me with this orientation? What happens to the nature of the person? The person is the 0 point. It's an empty container that it functions as the adjunction between differing categories, right? As the mean, we're not talking about an aggregate mean, so not a linear or a two-dimensional mean. So we're not talking average or aggregate. We're not talking, Chalcedonian logic would say unmixed, unconfused, undivided, all the four pillars of Chalcedonian Christology. The obverse mean, and this is what we mean in our kind of the logic of our theory. Obverse is just use the coin as an example, or my bad habits here, my little can of nicotine pouches, right? You have side A, side B, and then you have the edge that connects them. That's would be the best example because obverse is a numismatic or a coin related term, right? But what we're saying is essentially like the person is this, right? Between the two categories of side A and side B, but we're not talking just distinctly about two categories. Kant posits four. In category theory, you can posit an infinite amount of categories. The person is the adjunction. It's actually a nothing. It's the zero space. So there's a sense where as a person is an infinite mystery themselves. You will never know the full structure of selfhood yourself, right? And so what happens is that adjunctive capacity of the hypostasis of the person is the existential locus of these categorical experiences: quantity, quality, modality, relation, right? None of that exists. We can't think of those things outside of persons with the capacity to think of them, right? And to identify them as in some way or another real or not, right? And so when we kind of go back and we look at Kant, right? Kant says you can have no knowledge of the thing in itself, of the Ding an sich, right? Nagarjuna's rejoinder would be, well, that's because there is no Ding an sich to be identified. The ternary logic would say substrate. It's a substrate that's the mysterious plenum that's at the heart of all things. What we're saying is if Nagarjuna is identifying formlessness, what we're identifying in our up level is form. And this is a dialectical relationship between form and formlessness that's predicated on lack, right? And so the person is the mean through which all of this is known, right? So we can take things in existence that we would not typically call a person in any way, shape, or form. Like, I go back to the analogy of the rock. The rock is not a person, at least not in any straightforward and identifiable way. It has no independent hypostatic existence where it's processing multiple categories. It's just totally passive to whatever categories and cognitive realities are shaping it. The person becomes an active, is essentially like a kenotic receptacle of expressive reality. So when you're saying, well, what is the 0 point? What is the null point? Well, it's you, and then everything else we're going to say about it is an uncertainty, right? Which means you can kind of get around the edges, but you're never going to eclipse the event horizon of your own existence. I won't do that of mine. We certainly can't do that of divine existence because divine existence is by nature infinite, right? And whether you hold to substance metaphysics or not, we're using it as kind of shorthand terms. But what is actually actively metabolizing reality at its most fundamental level, whether you want to say there's some sort of minute hypostatic, maybe secondary hypostatic existence for an ant or an oak tree that passes into existence and out of existence, and the tree doesn't exist forever in a straightforward way. Maybe its form does, but and then repeats in other areas throughout the universe, but it's not maintaining like its own personal identity once it's been chopped down or falls in the forest or whatever. That can be an element, and that would be what I would call secondary hypostases, right? they actually do retain kind of a permanence in the memory of primary hypostases, right? And so memory is really important for the thinking subject. But really what the thinking subject is just think of it in terms of like in plumbing, you have a coupling between two pipes. It's just is realistically just an empty sleeve that they can both connect with. That's a good analogy for what a person actually is it's just a conduit. It's the empty conduit through which experience, thought, all these other things are possible. So when we're searching for the mean, what we're asking is, who am I? Right? And what do I think? And and then you begin to have to do, like, the really scary thing is to take responsibility for what you know and what you don't know, and to be epistemically honest about what you can and can't know. Right. So let me use an example for me as a believing, practicing Christian who has no problem swimming in Dharmic forms, atheistic forms, whatever. Right. And this comes out of my last name, Paschall, right? And it stuck out in my head when I started attending more liturgical. I grew up, Baptist-ish, some charismatic flavoring, transitioned into Reform, but then, I loved the Lutherans always, and the Catholics and the Orthodox and the Episcopals. This shows up in the movement of the liturgy. It's described as the Paschal mystery, right? And it's really summed in three core elements. You can just call them the three axioms of the Paschal mystery. Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ is coming again, right? And here's the thing about those axioms, or I don't question those. I believe them wholeheartedly, right? But I have to be honest about what those three things are positing and whether or not they are actually falsifiable claims at this point, right? So at the level of criticality, so critical analysis, critical scholarship's general consensus is Jesus of Nazareth existed and was crucified in Jerusalem somewhere in the 30s AD, right? So that's a generally agreed upon fact. Let's bracket our Muslim friends and brothers and sisters who would say, no, he wasn't, but people thought he was, right? There's a religious reason for saying no, that this didn't happen, but they still acknowledge that he's a prophet, he did exist, and all these kinds of things. But we can establish critically with a relative degree of confidence that this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, lived and died in, in the Holy Land in the first century AD. Right. That's something that we I think most responsible critical scholars agree on that. There's a few people that will say he was a mythical figure from the beginning. Fine. That's kind of the radical view, and we like those guys too. Right. But so there's your first axiom. It's you have some degree of critical confidence that you can place. Yeah, Christ died, right? That opens a lot of questions. Well, what happened before he died? Who was he? What did he teach? Where did he come from? All those kinds of questions. All of Christian theology arises out of these three axioms, right? The second one, Christ is risen, right? Well, that axiom, it does not fall into the grounds of criticality. We can't critically establish that as a fact, right? I believe it. As mysterious as it is, like, I do accept that, like, the entire Christian faith, it doesn't happen absent of the genuine belief that Jesus rose from the dead from the early community, right? Whatever that means. Was his body physical? Was it, a spiritual body? Whatever the resurrection actually was, they all really genuinely believed this. It's hard. I don't think that there was, a bunch of charlatans trying to, you know, wedge a narrative together, but we can't really establish. I mean, the Gospel of Mark kind of leaves the same open question: what happened, right? And so you can't establish that, right? As far as, I think it's establishable as an article of genuine faith or belief, but in terms of, can we, falsify the claims? We don't have sufficient evidence to make a determination yet. And then the third axiom is he's coming again. He will come again. Now, you could say that's being fulfilled already in the celebration of the Eucharist. If you're a real presence person, that can be kind of a foretaste of the parousia, or the second coming. And I believe that personally. But that is an event, a kind of a cosmic or global event that has not yet happened, that the entire faith rests upon in some way, whether it's at the end of time, or there's a kind of a more of a chiliastic or millennial type idea of an imminent judgment within history than an eschatological judgment at the end. Again, those are kind of not determined either. but that's a prediction of a future event, which means by necessity it cannot be falsified, right? So our faith rests on three axioms, one of which can be critically established, the other two of which cannot be critically established, right? That's the epistemic humility that I think that is really, for a thinking Christian, that's kind of a baseline requirement, right? We can posit all kinds of certainty, but there's no way that we can preserve ourselves from the possibility that our certainty is false because it can't be falsified. so when we're approaching, kind of like the universal and sometimes totalizing claims of Christianity, that it's somehow, whether you're kind of more like me, and I envision a resolution that looks very much like Teilhard de Chardin's omega point, which I think still obtains pluralistically, right? But there's still a kind of a universality or totality that we're saying that Christ in himself is subsuming. We have to understand the precarious ground we're standing on, of what we can and can't prove. And that needs to be taken into account for how we can actually be good neighbors, right? So if I'm working off of the fundamental assumption based on an unearned certainty that I am right and my Muslim neighbors are wrong, or my Mormon neighbors, even though they kind of somehow fit within the Christian milieu in a way, or my Buddhist friends and, my Hindu, whoever they are, whatever that stand outside of the Christian milieu in some way, I actually don't have a rational basis that isn't fideistic to say that they're wrong and be able to actually prove it. Now, I can prove it within the logic of my own system, but Gödel's uncertainty makes that a fundamental impossibility, right? So him coming again is what is actually required. The parousia is a required future event upon which, if it never happens, then the Christian story falsifies, right? And so we have to understand those kinds of things. Is like, yeah, I fully and confidently believe these things, but that's beyond the limits of rationality. There's something else there that grounds me in that truth, and it's not just because I figured it out and I've kind of sussed out a logical system and it's airtight and there's no possibility that I'm wrong. I have to concede at a rational level the Christian story could be a fable, right? That doesn't mean I believe it is. Like, I believe otherwise, but like, I can't prove this, the truth or the falsehood of this at that level because I don't have the data. So there's a certain kind of there's an anticipated future event, a phase transition, or whatever we want to call the parousia of whatever the cosmos looks like after that. There's a futurity to it that kind of leaves our system as still an open system because it is not determined and we cannot be certain. But that lack of certainty is the legacy of all Christian metaphysics and theology that is of any quality that moves from that. So I know that's kind of rambling, but I went on for a while. So I'll hand the ball back to you and you play with it for a little while.
No, all of that's outside. What's very interesting is for me how accepting that uncertainty about resurrection and coming again arguably actually makes you more like Jesus, which I've always found very interesting. That, because that uncertainty that you're saying that can actually make you a better neighbor for the Muslim or the atheist or whatever. Well, Jesus is sitting with, unbelievers or sinners or others or people outcasts of the community. So it's very interesting. For me, has always been interesting how the uncertainty about what the resurrection, what the second coming mean, because like you said, we can't, it's unfalsifiable. How that It's very interesting how that actually enables Christ-likeness, how that can actually make you more like Christ, how that's kind of part of the belief system, as if it's a feature. And for me, it is very compelling when you have, well, and of course I'm biased for Christianity, but it's very compelling for me when uncertainty plausibly seems to be a feature of the worldview to actually make you better at the worldview. Like, if you're better at being, I would argue you're better at being Christ-like to actually accept the uncertainty of the second two principles, right? So it's not like a kind of it translates into action that makes you more like Jesus, and
Right.
that is what I would expect for a worldview that I think is actually taking seriously well, I want to say the null space because it's going to be about actually a way of being. There's something about Jesus that I do associate with making these Heideggerian clearings, or these kind of like, oh, you think you know what God's going to do? He's going to follow the law. Well, he's going to surprise you. Actually, you need to be waiting. You need to diligently seek him. There's all this language of a certain sort of, well, being, don't sleep in the night, dang it. Don't fall asleep, be active, be aware, right? Which is different from a superposition in a way if you say, well, it could be true or false, right? It's like, no, diligently seek them, which is aided by the superposition in a certain way, this unknowing, but it actually translates into character of which is like Jesus.
Yeah.
So to me, that's just really, really important. You said a bunch of things that are really, really important. So human beings as the lack, as the 0 point, completely agree. There's always been something, whether it be in Zizek or Lacan or people like that want to associate subjectivity with a certain lack. Mm-hmm. And the question then becomes, is this lack merely an epistemological failure? Is it a kind of trick? Like, the example Hofstadter makes is when you have a video camera looking at the TV, you get that infinite regress. And there's the idea that maybe that's what the self is. It's a strange loop kind of structure. Or is it actually ontological because it has some structuring role in reality? Like the 0 point of the subject does something to reality, to what it can be and become, and how it can unfold, how it can curve, how it can blossom that it otherwise could not. Which then the interesting idea is what then, like you've already said it, is an active lack, an active nothing, like this active negation, right? So what would it mean for humans to be a kind of active null point? Now, I'm going to come back to that because I think that gets at, I want to, I know I'm bringing up this weird imagination form stuff today, but for me, it's like really tied to this. The other thing I want to say that I guess I'm also thinking about with the null point and how the thermodynamic, which to me, again, I associate with a letting being, like that's saying like letting reality unfold, like you're actually accepting how thermodynamics works in a certain sense and how it has an unfolding. And I think that's, Grace made a beautiful Barbie that she's showing me. So it's really, really one. You want to hand it to me for a minute? Like you want to see? It's really fantastic. So this is the Barbie. So Grace made it. You did a really good job, Grace. It's really fantastic.
Yeah, great job.
Really well done. So there's a certain sort of observing, like you're observing the unfolding, right? So the question is, when you observe the unfolding, the form, I'm going to say the metageometry, is that an active negation? Is that an activity that somehow has causal impact on how reality unfolds, that it wouldn't unfold without that observation, that is in a certain way nothing but an observation? So it's a kind of null point, and yet in it, it actually changes what is possible. I want to say the virtual, and let me come back to wording that. But what I'm also thinking about is how I understand, because you've been pointing to it very, very critically, is my children are pouring water on top of themselves now out of a plastic bag. Fantastic. It's 8 p.m. Why not? So there is this sort of, there's this absolute knowing. So what you were saying about uncertainty, I know I don't know, right? And how that's almost the beginning of thought. I do associate that with absolute knowing in Hegel. And Alex Ebert puts it very well. Like, so there's always this quest in philosophy for a presupposition-less philosophy, a philosophy that doesn't have to assume anything, right? Because if you assume something, like a Rousseauian in nature, we were happy, or a Hobbesian in nature, we were red in tooth and claw, or whatever. That's a presupposition, right? So the dream is a philosophy that has no presuppositions. It assumes nothing, which of course you would say, well, that's good luck, buddy. That's pretty impossible, right? Mm-hmm. But the question is the following. Does it require a presupposition to say, I don't know everything? Is unknowing and uncertainty a presupposition, or is it not, right? Mm-hmm. And what's very interesting, what I want to argue, not that Hegel uses this language, is that Hegel is going to try, instead of thinking, he overcomes the problems of presupposition with something I want to call intersuppositional, which is in encounter, in kind of encountering your limits, right? And because you encounter it, there's reason to think it's actual, not assumed, right? Like, and that's why he says stuff like the fear of error is the fear of truth. Because when I encounter getting something wrong, 2 + 2 = 7, I didn't
Mhm.
assume anything. I experience it, right?
Mhm.
And thus it is possible for me to reasonably think that error and, unknowing, uncertainty is not something I assume. It's actually a feature of reality.
Mhm.
Therefore, a good philosophy is going to be based on I know I don't know, which of course you could argue with Socrates, the man who knew nothing, right? Of course. And
Right.
it's like, but the critical move is that I think Hegel wants to argue that there's a certain development in uncertainty, which is encountered. You have to encounter what you don't know. You can't simply posit it. You have to encounter it. It has to surprise you, right? And then to get really weird, this is incredibly hard to do because we can't actually think uncertainty. Because if I'm talking about uncertainty right now, I know I'm talking about uncertainty, right? Like I know, like when I know, there's also the problem when you're wrong about something, you're wrong about it. So you have to experience reality as grasping. The phenomenology of being is a certain grasping, right? Well,
Yeah.
that's a problem because that means you're kind of set up by how you experience the world to really not fully get uncertainty. Because every time you talk about uncertainty, you understand what you're talking about, right? And so
Right.
you're kind of betrayed by phenomenology. And the move that Hegel makes, as I would put it, that's really, really weird, but is I think does this work of this active negation that I think also you see in the null space. He says something like this: you are limited from experiencing your limits, which means you must feel unlimited. And so what you're limited from experiencing your limits. So it's like what he's trying to do is like you have Kant's noumenon, right? That keeps you from the thing in of itself. But
Right.
what he wants to say is it's not merely the limit keeping you from things, but you're limited from actually experiencing limitation. Because when you look out on the world, I experience a car, I experience clouds. I don't experience myself naturally as limited from grasping things. I have to be told I don't get the thing in of itself. I have to be told I'm not getting the full picture. I have to be taught I have uncertainty, right? And so what he's trying to do is from experiences of encountering limitation in history or
Mhm.
error, you then posit a larger metaphysic limit, which is that your entire being is structured by the inexperience to experience your own limits, your own uncertainty. And that is your limit. And so here you're limited from experiencing limit, and that's your limit. That actually by grasping, now thought can always move because there's now ever emotion now.
Yeah.
And again, I'll say it one more time because it's so tricky and it kind of makes my head hurt, is that because you're limited from experiencing limit,
Mhm.
you must experience yourself as unlimited. But that means it's like idolatry, like God. You naturally experience yourself not with uncertainty. The necessity of experiencing yourself as unlimited is a true limit, a bad limit. That's what's holding you back. The
Mhm.
birth of philosophy is realizing that your natural experience of not having limitation is your very limit. But
Yeah.
that has to be gained abstractly and remembered in memory. And you have to actively bring it into all of your experiences of phenomenon. And basically, he's arguing until you recalibrate your phenomenology that way, you can't do philosophy. Like if you don't learn that from the phenomenology of spirit, then everything he's talking about in the science of logic, it ain't going to mean anything. You're not going to get it because you're not, as the subject, going to be actively bringing an awareness of your own inability to experience your limits to your life. And what this does in a very practical sense is mean that you live in such a manner where you try to experience phenomenon unveiling themselves to you more than you trying to dissect it, going back to the autopsy example, right? Because if I can't experience my own limits and that's how I'm limited, then I need to have more of a posture of receiving.
Mhm.
I have to have more of a posture of beholding so the thing can surprise me. And
Yeah.
then I can, and so you have to phenomenologically, in this sense, act as a 0 point. But that 0 point is very, very active. And then here is the question I wonder about: is I think there's something about that orientation that is the prerequisite for experiencing the forms, witnessing the forms, and then the experience of the form, which I'm associating with this reading of a book and having a movie in your head, that to me is the bringing together of the categories, like you were saying. In the linchpin, you're taking the abstract, but you're bringing it into determination. And what you're trying to
Can I pause you
behold,
there?
please, please.
So important because you're identifying the mechanism. You are the tension between the dead words on the page and the images that are being produced as a result of analyzing the written material. The semantic material is, I mean, when nobody says the printed words on the page are living things, but there's a living word. The living word is, I'm reading Lord of the Rings and I'm imagining the defense of Minas Tirith, right? That movie is playing in my head as I'm reading. Autopsy is the reading. The imagination is the active dimension of cognition. So anyway, I'll go hand it
That's
back to you.
exactly right. And that I think something like reading is what philosophy is after. Like that, and philosophy too. Again, I agree with Leibniz that metaphysics is actually the proper term for it. Should have been metageometry, not
Right.
metaphysics. And because you're actually trying to have a reading of reality where you experience the metageometry of how everything unfolds in of itself, and like the ways you were describing, or the past kind of, it has a form, it has a geometry, but what you're doing there is you're using, therefore, abstract thought to see what things are in their determination that is not given in their immediacy. Like that car is following a thermodynamic metageometry, but it's not given in its
Absolutely.
immediacy. But I have to play a movie in my head where I see it unfolding as that thermodynamic metageometry. And that's when I am properly stewarding reality as the subject. This is what the subject is supposed to do. And it's weird because it's something like this is what the subject is supposed to do as this 0 point, as this steward of being, as Heidegger might say, right? And what then it seems to be the case, well, then I want to say things like, if the average person in a socioeconomic system is able to use thinking this way, there's more non-zero sum growth. The economic system changes, the politics changes, it has impacts on global pluralism, how we interact with other people, what we believe. Like when you talk with people, the goal then becomes a shared experience of this thermodynamic metageometry in the null point versus who's right and who's wrong, right? Where, it's this shared attentiveness that then also I think is experienced as beautiful, because there is a certain beauty. Because when you watch the form in this abstract way I'm describing, like a movie playing in your head, there's this tension of it's not going to hold together. It's all pure potential, but then it falls into a Markov blame and it has a determination, and it could have been anything, but it now has to be this thing. And that's what history is going to show. So there's an actuality, but that opens a new potentiality that's curving because of the virtual future. And it takes this form and it catches itself, and then it catches itself, and and all things become like that. I guess Dr. Meadows talks about a dynamic equilibrium as the example of, if there's a whirlpool in the bath, but you keep pouring an equal amount of water into the bathtub going out, then you get a dynamic equilibrium.
Which, by the way, is a great description, like another way of describing the obverse mean or the hypostases. You can describe it in spectral dynamics as a standing wavefront, but structurally what it looks like is exactly that.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's fun.
And
Yeah,
so, yeah, the infinite energies basically being poured through the grid lines of reality, creating current and flow, and you are topologically very much, it looks like a whirlpool, right? I mean, the actual geometry looks that way. And so that's exactly it.
well, in 1000%. And then for me, there's something about every possible phenomenon that has that dynamic equilibrium to it, but it's not given in its immediacy. You have to use abstract reasoning to see it with your imagination, like the movie playing in your head of Marvin the Mouse. But you're therefore not using your imagination for fantasy. You are using it for the fullness of the phenomenon, for the fullness of what the thing is, as this thermodynamic metageometry that you can then observe and witness and see, and thus thought becomes something more like you witness versus just something you process. And then my giant claim would be that the work of the person, what a person does to become the kind of person who can do that, is going, the spillover effects are going to be good for the politic, good for the family, good for the economy, and good for all these other things. And the reason I say all that is because then the telos of the human can actually be kind of a 0 point to simply have this role of observing the forms and to actually be the steward, the linchpin of bringing the abstract and the immediate together. And yet that's not meaning you end up with the society falling apart. Actually, because here's the key, because you said it earlier, virtual and virtue go together. So you actually have to develop virtue to have this experience, which then changes what the future can be. Like it changes the curvature of the future because the future is virtual. So therefore, if you have the spillover effects of a people dedicated to this work, to experience thought as such, is actually non-zero sum for the society. It benefits everyone. And so then that's how you get the human as a 0 point, that actually in achieving this kind of 0 point way of being, the spillover is actually beneficial economically, socially, in terms of family. I think it's the only way to basically sublate desire into drive ultimately in the psychoanalytical way, so we're not destroyed by desire. I think it's basically the point of eros. I think this is why we have eros, is for this experience. And that experience of the fun, because it's like there's this weird way in which it sounds really, really passive to simply be observing the forms in the way I'm describing it, but the amount of activity it takes to get there is quite high. It's the lift, but then it's Sabbath again. That's the auto mastery of Sabbath, ultimately, is what we're describing that we said last time. But let me throw it to you on any thoughts on anything.
So, so you're, again, this is where Cusa becomes really helpful, right? Because, and in some sense, like, because I've been reading in Cusanus for, for about a year now, and he's become really important. I needed some of his logical formulae to arrive at some of our core theoretical insights. So he's vastly important to what we do. The first thing I'll say is metageometry precedes metaphysics, or geometry precedes physics. You get the physics after the geometry, right? Very important. And that shows up, basically that's maybe one of the core insights of just Platonic thought in general, right? There's the physics are not prior to the form. But with Cusanus, you have this notion that one must learn ignorance, the docta ignorantia, right? We learn a kind of ignorance. Now let's frame that, but let's add to the frame. Ignorance is a problem if you go into the Dharmic schools. It's actually what all suffering really ultimately is arising from. So we're going to distinguish avidya, like not knowing in the Dharmic sense, with ignorance in the Cusan sense, right? Is, our starting point. We enter into this world just shrouded in ignorance. We know basically nothing, and that's a threat. We're actually, as born in our infancy, we're completely vulnerable to the world because we know nothing about it, right? And all the problems that happen in the world are in some sense as a result of that kind of originary ignorance. That's an ignorance that has to be overcome. And in some sense, that's overcome through experience, through abstract reasoning, logic, right? And that's really the first side of the exercise that we went through with Nagarjuna's tetralemma, right? Is you eventually, you have to kind of, you go through affirmation, denial, both, neither. And that's the point where you've learned ignorance, right? Is that you come to this point where you've learned ignorance. And this has been like, just even in my, like, I'm kind of an antsy dude. Like I like ideas, but I only really like them if I can do something with them, right? So as a contemplative, like I will spend time, in that quiet place, finding, whether that's through centering prayer, Zen type meditation, getting into that silent space. It's really uncomfortable. It's not fun to not think because you just catch yourself, oh, there's another thought. I just thought again, and you're watching this like cascade of basically failures to do the thing you're setting out to do. So it's a very humbling process, but every once in a while you touch into this place where it's like you can't say anything about it. Like there's nothing to be said about it because once you say something about it, you're betraying what it actually is. But it's this place of like peaceful awareness, right? The problem is like whether you call that like the pure emptiness in Buddhist thought or pure form in Christian thought, like what do you do with that? Right. And this is where the like I found that to just abide in that space of pure negation is insufficient, right? But it's important, right? Because what Cusa says is you must learn ignorance basically through a rigorous rational process. If you read his writings, they're just the metaphors are so explosive. They break your brain every time you read them, right? Because you eventually arrive at these aporias and contradictions, and he says, no, no, that's the point. The walled garden of paradise, in which is kind of the holy of holies itself, is hedged by contradiction or the coincidence of opposites, right? And like from within, if you grant him like the integrity of his own logic, he's correct, right? You can debate it external to his logic, whether that obtains outside of his logic, but let's just work within his logic then. So there's a certain kind of knowing that you can have that is not anti-rational, but it's beyond rationality. And it's just an abiding space. It's the zero spot that you can't, it's literally cannot be thought, it cannot be articulated. Right. And we get really uncomfortable with that in the West because we want to identify the thing in itself. And Kant says, no, there's really no way you can do that. And I think Kant, to a degree, is very correct. But I would say that his phenomenology extends all the way to the very frontier and the horizon of intelligibility itself. Those things are actually knowable. Doesn't mean we know them now, but theoretically, that knowledge is possible. But what we're doing, once you have come to the point of uncertainty or ignorance, the learned ignorance, the good kind of ignorance, that has to be metabolized, right? It has to be metabolized. You can't do nothing with it and then just return to binary logic of affirmation and negation and assume that that's going to do all the work for you because you can sit in a space that basically puts you into placid resignation that nothing really exists and I can't really say anything about it, right? And like it's there's an existential dissatisfaction I have with that kind of I get bothered by it, kind of like an oyster that's got the sand. It's just like it's I keep looping around the darn thing until like something has got to emerge here, or I'm just going to be stuck here forever with this irritant. But it's that irritant that said for me that was saying like, well, what comes after negation? Because if nothing really comes after negation, there's nothing worth talking about. It's true nihilism. But it's when you structuralize negation, right, as opposed to just ending in negation, when it becomes a structure of thinking itself, or a structure of uncertainty becomes a structural element of thinking itself, then you're ready to do the real business of thinking and imagining and constructing into the future. That's what we've always done. We don't recognize that that's what happened. When you look at the Notre Dame Cathedral, that's the confluence of, you know, 3,000 years of history being encoded into a single piece of architecture that was only possible once Gothic forms were discovered. And, like, but that's an encoding of a whole system of in a way of viewing the world and is beautiful, stunningly beautiful. And there's like a whole symbolic order encoded within that building, right? It is a temple-like function. But that was only possible because of all of the thought forms that preceded it, right? But somebody had to imagine what it's going to look like, how we're going to build it, how I'm going to manage the crews, and like how we're going to, try to keep the workplace reasonably safe, as reasonably as you can expect it in medieval Europe. And, all these kinds of things are an important part of the constructive process, right? So we go through kind of this destructive autopsy, figuring out what killed the patient, but then now that I know what killed the patient, when I'm starting to think into how do I build something that doesn't kill the patient, that's the imagination, that's the lack, that's the uncertainty, that's the unknown. And as opposed to saying like, because I can't know anything, there's nothing worth thinking about. That's I would say understandable, but at least I don't want to be too harsh, but I think it amounts to a kind of intellectual cowardice, right? That says I don't have to think about anything because of Gödel's incompleteness. Your map is just as equivalent to my map, and it's like it creates these false equivalencies that neutralize critical thought, rational thought, or even the capacity for intuition, right? So to me, these are kind of they're born out of existential side, and there's a pragmatic side. You actually kind of need to figure this stuff out when we're talking about cognitive systems like artificial intelligence. Well, how do we want to construct that? What is constructible within this envelope? And then what is responsibly constructible within this envelope? Because those are two different questions. Um, but so you got to get into the kind of the fundamentals of what cognition is, and you kind of need that physics. Otherwise, what are you grounding your AI in? Right now, currently, it's substantially grounded probabilistically, but which is uncertainty. You do need the determination. You need the deterministic math of physics to begin to make sure that your system is well grounded. So indeterminacy and determinacy, we're always toggling between that dialectic. And that's exciting, right? That's the exciting piece of like the whole philosophical endeavor is like, we're never going to really arrive there. We might, like, I don't know of anybody that's really overcome Nagarjuna's logic without problem, right? And what we're doing is we're not overcoming it. We're just saying, we're going to take your fundamental insight and we're going to up dimension that insight and we're going to ingest it. So nothing you're saying here is like wrong in and of itself, but it's perhaps not complete, right? Which means that whatever discoveries we're making in the present age, they're not going to be complete either, but it becomes a foundation that the next generations can work off and becomes an impetus for their discovery. And that's how this grand human experiment unfolds in time. And so that's kind of what animates the discovery, but the sense of discovery. But like the deeper intuition, and one of the things that really animates my deepest concerns is like, what does it mean to be a person? Because people are important, right? Working within that kind of basic frame and register that says, people are made in God's image. Well, what does that mean? And what does that mean for me as I steward my own personhood, right? Because I have a responsibility to do that. But what does that mean as I encounter the other? And there's always confrontation and friction and those kinds of things. Those are inevitable because we have kind of residual original ignorance, which may be our original sin, right? That has to you got to overcome those things. But dealing with the logic of personhood, it's hard to say like what I don't know, and this is infinitely mysterious to me. Is person the foundational ontological category? I don't know. Like I don't know how to resolve that. That's a paradox I just can't even get my mind around. But it is certainly the question. It's one that gets raised is like, if everything is kind of dependently arising in some sense, like Nagarjuna is talking about, but then we also have this kind of either a Platonic emanation or divine creatio ex nihilo, like we're intentional purposive creation, you know, like what comes first? And I don't know. I mean, it's like Christian theology would say in some sense these are simultaneous, like, and you can't abstract time into these properties because that would be, you collapse into fallacy. But even in terms of logical priority, it's very difficult because it's like you are, in some sense, you're trying to suss out where that non-dual reality resides or that monistic structure is. And it's really hard to find because like it may not be anything that we could rationally describe, or easily, it's like there's a horizon that my thought runs against. And so
that is a fundamental mystery. And no, many things come to mind for that. And I suppose at some point I should help make sure the children are in bed. I don't know where the time
Yeah,
goes.
I
It's
got
always a
I got to
delight.
bounce here pretty
I
quickly too.
understand. There's something about, for me, if personhood is most fundamental, if that's the way to put it, then somehow personhood and Sabbath have to go together because Sabbath has to be most fundamental. And
Mhm.
then if subjectivity creates time, is there something about time that is personal? Like time is somehow personal, which then if it's Sabbath at its most level versus the fake clock time, that's something. And then if personhood is this capacity for beholding the forms, which is a 0 point, then the most fundamental thing is a 0 point because it's simply resting in the form. It's like this, like the most fundamental thing is a certain resting in the form. And the fullness of personhood is that. Not, I think we associate personhood with personal expression and individuality. And of course, there's truth to that. But what if personhood is most fundamentally, like in terms of metageometry, the very resting in the form? That that and then if you do that, you become one of one Whitestone name to allude to Luke. You become the most particular person you can possibly be from this resting in the form. And that would mean at the most fundamental level of reality is that auto mastery on the other side of struggle. And we're returning to the origin then, because we're remembering what we come from, right? Like Plato
Right.
memory, there's a regaining of the memory that actually there is a certain auto mastery at the foundation of all of being. And this is then getting to me into this very important question of what's after pure negation, like that, learning not to think. Um, so again, I appreciate you talking this evening because this is all the crazy stuff, and I really enjoy speaking with you about it. And it's stuff that I circle and come back to all the time. Um, it would say, and then and so to say something just first off, like a lot of the theory of belonging, just as kind of a note, there's a lot of belonging again is about the socioeconomic condition because that's a book of sociology and politics and economics. I'm interested. I think that human subjectivity without this training, because we're basically, I think there's a training to everything we're describing, the training of virtue.
Mhm.
Without that training, we naturally head towards something I call dream equality, which is
Mhm.
where thought becomes like a dream. It wants to be a dream, but it
Mhm.
wants to do it over determination, not with determination. It wants to leave limitation behind, not identify with ignorance and limit and all of those different things. And so for me, we have to create the socioeconomic conditions to incubate subjects who use imagination not for dream equality, as I call it, but for witnessing the form, ergo the metageometry. We need to actually create subjects of whom imagination is used in service of metageometry, which is the marriage of rationality and imagination, and thus full personhood, because there's something about full personhood that is the marriage of imagination and rationality, logos, eros, thymos, all of those things together. Now, that's just one note that has to be expanded upon. Um, the second thing I was going to say is so we have to use imagination for that. So there's something there. The second thing I was going to say is that, like you're saying, okay, so you do this pure negation. Oh, the thing I was going to say is you never leave behind. I completely agree. The true, false, the superposition, and the no, you never leave any of them behind. The way
Mhm.
I like to put it is that you can only find the girdle point by doing the work of the map. You can't skip the work of the map because then
Right.
you're just asserting the girdle point. You have to find it, which means you have to do the work of true, false, rational. You have to do rationality really, really well to get to the quote unquote non-rational. It's not that you can, no, you have to go through the rational to find the girdle point, which means you
Yeah.
have to find the superposition potential, which you could use for invincibility, but then you use that to dwell in the null point. But you always have them all. So completely agree. You can only, it is not girdle point leaving the map behind. The map makes possible the girdle point, and the girdle point, which could be used for the invincibility of the map, which is where it gets into, I think a lot of the problems that we can see today. You're using it for the dwelling in the null point. So that was a point. The thing I was going to say is so when you have that, you learn how to have, I'm just going to say, the pure negation. That's the term I'll use here, just pure negation. Like you say, what do you do with that, right?
Yeah.
So what it would seem to be is that you have to learn how to go through that. But the next phase, what I always find very interesting, and I'm not saying that there's an emphasis on community in Christianity, going to the other person, relationship in other person. So there's pure negation in isolation. But how do you do pure negation with other people, right? Like around other people. It's one thing to learn how to like not be lost in that angry voice in your head alone. It's another thing to do it when you're around other people. That's way harder. And I would argue if you don't go on any you could even say isolationist monastic period in your life, you're not going to do that. So I'm not saying it's anti-monastic. I'm saying that, you have to, you have to first learn how to do that pure negation before you can even begin to talk about what kind of subject is able to do it in a social setting or in a community with other people. But then the question becomes, this is the question: what are you modeling or showing to other people if you do that? Like what is being shown that then would perhaps inspire and that could kind of spread? And then how does that relate to the observing of the forms, like the watching of the forms, right? So this is a way I think about it. And then I'll give it to you on any thoughts. And then like I said, I suppose I should go. But anyway, I always enjoy speaking with you. So when you learn to look at the phenomenon in front of you, and I'll just say the crepe myrtle, and you actually come to observe the metageometry. So there's this form that, in a sense, is catching the phenomenon. Like however it unfolds, something catches it. It keeps its form. It has all this customization, can do all these things, and yet it's held. There's a kind of helding. It's form and holding go together, right? Like these things kind of go together. It holds itself, right? But you don't witness that in the immediacy. You come to observe that, learn that in the null point where the abstract and the imagination is used to witness the metageometry, right? Well, if that's happening for the crepe myrtle, why isn't that happening for you? Why aren't you as a subject also part of a metageometry that is catching you? You can kind of rest in, like, why wouldn't it be the case that there's not also a metageometry holding you, right? That is catching you, that no matter how it unfolds, it's got you in its hand, like God's sustaining being. And if you really believe that, which is hard to believe, then when you're worried about tomorrow, what shall you eat? What shall you drink? Look at the birds you're able to look at the birds of the air. And you're actually able to then gain a sort of thing where you can see yourself in the world being like operating, almost like watching that movie in your head. And there is something to being that is actually holding you and sustaining you. And you don't have to worry about controlling everything. You don't have to worry about having a full understanding. There's a certain artfulness to life. There's a certain kind of flow. There's a certain sort of behavior of how you go through your day when you're not consumed by fear or consumed or worried about those thieves that can break in or the moths that consume. You're not concerned about these things because you understand that if all phenomena have this metageometry that kind of sustain them, then so do you. And the issue is thinking is usually what makes us forget that. Because we're worried, how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to do that? Oh, I got to control this. So we're constantly forgetting the form. We're constantly forgetting the metageometry. That I think the joy of pure negation is you feel it. You feel the actual, there's an experience in that pure presence, that pure negation of the metageometry holding things. Like the problem is your thinking is always getting in the way of that experience of the metageometry. And so when you can stop yourself from thinking, you hold it, you feel it, and you're like, oh, there's actually the lack is a plenta. The lack has a life. There's a structure to it, right? What you want to do is show that, like, we're not going to know the fullness of what it is to be a person until we can do that with others and all together rest in that Sabbath. Rest in that kind of trust in the unfolding metageometry. But we tend to forget it because that person annoys you, or that some person said something stupid, or that person is evil or whatever. So we enter judgmentalism. And once you're in judgmentalism, the form is gone. You don't have the pure presence. we have to encounter the limit of the other, the surprise of the other. We have to be surprised by limit and not disturbed, because we can't experience our own limit, only be surprised by them. So we thus have to be able to handle the encounter of limit, the surprise of the other person, and maintain the observing of the metageometry, which that translates into a certain artfulness of how we carry ourselves in the world, that is alignment with personhood as perhaps most fundamental. But and then to the degree that we can do that with other people and have an auto mastery in that with other people, that then can inspire them to do it, and they inspire us back, and we get a positive feedback loop, then you get that kind of lift in community and with other people. And then we start to actually experience what the fullness of the human being is as this steward, as this null point. And that work of bringing and I'll throw it to you, that work of bringing the pure negation into community, into the social, that ultimately I think is experienced as, do you really trust the metageometry? That's ultimately what it is. Do you actually trust it? Do you think this thing is holding you or not? You've seen it, you've imagined it, you've done the work of being able to experience the movie playing in your head of the metageometry, but do you actually believe in it? Do you actually think it's holding you? Do you actually have that courage? You've experienced, but now do you really believe it? That, for me, what comes after the pure negation, is the actual finding out if you believe that thing that you've abstractly observed as the metageometry is holding you. And this also is why this also, for me, points to why the metageometry has to be experienced abstractly, because otherwise it would be a fact and wouldn't demand courage. And it is courage that makes the world in this sense, right? Because then it would be meaningless. So the fact that it requires this abstract reasoning to observe, that then you have to do the work of holding in memory when you encounter the other who annoys you, so you're tempted to forget what you learned in pure negation, that then makes it virtue developing. That it thus actually changes the conditions of possibility to actually creating more life, if you will. And that is also then why the experience of the metageometry has to be in this strange abstract way that takes work to get, because otherwise it would be a fact and it wouldn't demand development. It wouldn't demand development of the person to experience. And if there is something about personhood that is most fundamental, then if there's any point in reality where there's a lack of the possibility of the development of personhood, then there would be a necessary limitation to what that fundamental level could become, and that would be a God beyond God, right? That would be something setting limits on God, and so that can't be the case. But I'll throw it back to you on any thoughts.
So, I'm in the middle of, like I said, we've got a viable business that, like I told you prior, like we're about to our launch phase for the startup I'm working on. But to keep the lights on, as a man without significant financial means, I'm working at a local convenience store, the Circle K. So strange things are always afoot at the Circle K. Bill and Ted were absolutely right. And it's a block and a half from my house, easy for me to walk there. It just covers keeps the electricity going and top ramen in my belly. And obligations to family, and there's a shared sacrifice that we're all in the middle of, getting this thing off the ground. And you're aware of that. You do the same thing. You engaging in entrepreneurship. It's like staring into the void most of the time. But what I've learned is there's a kind of yoga of this work, right? That, because like a lot of times I'm a clerk or a cashier, but it's like a part-time bouncer, right? Because it's where the riffraff like to hang out, in the parking lot, and some of them are delightful riffraff, and some of them are quite frankly dangerous, right? And so I'm constantly finding myself, and I never know when the challenge is going to come. It could be weeks between incidents, but something's going to happen. Guarantee it's going to happen, right? Something's going to pop off. I'm going to have to kick somebody out of the store, try to get them off the premises. And you're a hybrid between a bouncer and a cashier. And I mean, I'm a 150 pounds soaking wet right now. I mean, I was, a former wrestler. I can take care of myself, but I've had to like kind of go back and say, like, where my failures have been in those exchanges. And then there's been a few where you just got to you got to be bold, and you're kind of protecting the space and protecting the other customers that are there. Um, what I realized is like my responses were adequate, right? It diffused a dangerous or potentially dangerous situation, but I had to go back and reflect on those experiences, and I have to say, like, what could I have done differently, right? And oftentimes, what I'm realizing is peace is a failure to reach peace is always preceded by a failure of imagination,
Mm,
right?
yes.
Like, I have not created the conditions of peace before I arrived in the moment of crisis. If the conditions of peace are not already present within me and I'm not aware of those, it just turns into confrontation, loud arguments, pushing, shoving, all that kind of stuff. And it's not a pleasant aspect of my work, but it certainly is a part of it sometimes. But what I've learned through the process is, as a Christian who tries to contemplate, when we do the rosary and those kinds of things, like we're contemplating the various mysteries surrounding the person of Christ, right, or connected to Mary and those kinds of things. And as I reflect on those, like I always come back to is that our axioms of the Paschal mystery notwithstanding, like in that moment of contemplation, Jesus appears to me to be the most real person ever, right? Why? And I would put it along, right with him. Like Buddha is kind of, Siddhartha Gautama is this fully realized person. And what have both of them done? They are not worried about what kind of person they are. Who am I? They're not obsessed with that driving question in the same way so the grasping ceases. And the structure of personhood, when it is fully realized, is not an attainment, it's a letting go into the domain of pure expression. And in order for us, either individually or, maybe someday as a species to begin to grapple with like I become the most real when I am the least obsessed with, am I a self? Am I not a self? Am I, it's just living in that, occupying the geometry, occupying the form and the emptiness and the kind of the space between those notes. That's where, if form and emptiness are both magic, the real magic is in the space between, which is where I occupy that space. That's the rhythm of and structure of being itself. And so, it's like, yeah, there's practical applications that are really fascinating with all this. It's this logical framework is really important potentially to AI architecture. So there's a pragmatic side of what I'm working on. The most exciting part of it never it's like, oh, this is like an engine for ceaseless discovery, and for a curious cat like me, that's like catnip, you know and because I'm not that smart, but I'm really curious, right? So that it makes me seem smart. But I'm actually not. I would, I've got a decent intellect and nothing more than that. And so it's like those are the things where it's like I know that I derive a lot of enjoyment. And I derive the enjoyment of our conversations because, like, I'm going to come back to this and I'm going to review it, and I'm going to go, wow, those are all the things that Daniel said that I wasn't able to grasp in the moment because it's so evanescent. And come back to these things, and there's a lot of discovery here. And that's the exciting part of the whole enterprise, is not what can I build with it, but I'm a person obsessed with that question, you know, but it's like, that's not ultimately, that in itself can just be ego service and, those kinds of things. So, you know, grappling with the lack, like we've talked about, grappling with the uncertainty is actually the most exciting part about thinking, because that's when thinking is no longer a dead artifact, but it's actually a living geometry.
I completely agree. And I, again, never know where the time goes. And I always greatly appreciate speaking with you. And yeah, I mean, just to speak to what you were saying about um this failure of like meeting certain conditions, and that's why there was an escalation. Like there wasn't adequately did the work to have the peace so that things went a certain way. I have experienced in my life where basically a failure to hold the memory of what God has done in my life, if you lose that, then you have anger or something goes wrong, or you're
Right.
worried about the bills, right? Or you're worried about tomorrow. And
Right.
to me, or the times of glimpsing the form or having these experiences of the metageometry, and then you forget them, right? Like there's something about, because again, obviously, this entire conversation, I'm extremely interested in just these kind of mysterious notions in classical philosophy. I used to really hate Plato. I didn't want anything to do with him. And then I found out, oh, well, that was just the popular understanding of Platonism being about perfect forms, when really it's about the formulation of phenomenon more
Right.
than this idea. And really, as I understand it, don't quote me on it, the entire notions of there having to be a perfect cup is precisely in order to say that there must therefore be a trajectory by which things can form to become the perfect cup. The form, ulation, is more important than the perfection, if you will. But people
Right.
think that the form is the perfection, but it's to say that everything must have an unfolding. Like there must be a potential unfolding in all things. Well, then the question is, what is that unfolding? So it's not this kind of disembodied thing. It's a
Right.
question of the kind of the trajectory of phenomenon. I've used the image of bowling gutters and bowling alleys where a ball goes in and it follows. There's a sense in which the forms are like gutters that things fall into and become themselves, but it's more
That's a
positive. It's
scientifically based statement. That's actually true.
bam. Yeah, heck yeah. And so and that's what I've come to understand that Plato is getting at. And I also agree with my dear friend Thomas Jockin that Aristotle and Plato have more overlap than has been traditionally understood, that there's a lot going
Right.
on and they're both very interested in beauty. But the point is that there is something about so much of the work is actually just holding the memory of those glimpses of eternity through the transience, those glimpses of the form, and that to the degree you can really hold that memory against the temptations to forget it, the temptations to let the angry voice in your head, the temptation to worry, is to the degree you then fall into more of an entropic state, to the degree you're not actually kind of in the art of living, as Ivan Illich might say, right? And so there, and then to me, this has always been helpful for the dilemma as well in Christianity between works and faith. And are you saved by faith? Or are you saved by works? Well, there's something where the work of faith is a holding of a memory, and the initial glimpse and glimmer that you had that you need to hold the memory of feels very mysterious. It feels like God just blessed you one day, right?
Yeah.
But there is a real work in remembering and holding the memory. Like it's a real work to hold the memory, but the memory that you have to hold was a gift of faith.
Yeah.
So, and then bringing the kind of being that makes you or makes human beings as full persons into community without losing it, that I associate strongly with the work of the Christian.
Mhm.
That I associate that strongly with, I think, what Jesus was doing, like what made Jesus Jesus.
Right.
And it is a work of a memory that is trying to keep you believing that the metageometry is holding you, which of course means God is holding you. It means, that you actually are living in that manner. And then there would be reason to believe that the successful doing of this is participating in how life is supposed to unfold. That that there is something about this that is part of the love that moves the sun and other stars, and to bring it into the lives of ourselves and others. But Jedidiah, always a pleasure to speak with you, sir. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.